Matthew chapter 14 through 23 is the second last division in the book of Matthew. It's the largest section, and I'm not really sure why Matthew organizes his book this way. As I said, I'm still learning about this book. I think the reason at present, anyway, why this is such a large section in the book is because Jesus knew that he was going to be rejected a long time before he actually was put on the cross. Right? And yet he remained faithful. And there's a very practical value in watching and analyzing the life of Jesus in a situation like that for us today. Because it's one thing for us to minister when things are rosy, to be good moms and dads and parents when things are fine. It's another thing to be faithful under pressure when it's difficult. And Jesus' public ministry was basically about 3.5 years long. Someone has said the first year of his ministry was the year of obscurity, the second year of his ministry was the year of popularity, the third year of his ministry was the year of opposition. And that year of opposition is largely what is covered in chapters 14 to 23 in the book of Matthew. A good third of his ministry of his public ministry was done under the full heat and light of the opposition of the spiritual leaders in the country, and with the certainty even in his disciples' minds and hearts that he was going to die. And yet he was faithful. That's the point. Okay? It's hard for us to learn this lesson. I'm still learning it. I've been a Christian from a young age, and I struggle a great deal today with that. Still, it's a lifelong learning process about being faithful under trial, being faithful under pressure. I don't work good under pressure. I can think good under pressure. I can get more done in 4 hours on a Wednesday afternoon preparing for this class than I could, say, in 3 days prior to it, because the pressures are on. We're procrastinators like that. But it's hard to control our mouths. It's hard to control our impulses. It's hard to change learned behaviors when we've spent 25 or 30 years of our lives ingraining ourselves in bad habits, in reacting to situations and pressure in people. So I still have trouble. I imagine I always will. Right? But Jesus demonstrated in his life faithfulness even under pressure. That's really what the message of this large section in the book of Matthew is. If you want a title for the section, the 7th section in the book of Matthew, the heading is entitled The Faithful Ministry of Christ the Rejected King. The Faithful Ministry of Christ the Rejected King. Sounds like a mouthful, but now I'm going to put the tape on pause and we're going to have a little review quiz. Okay, what's the theme of the book of Matthew? Christ is presented in Matthew as the king. In Mark, he is presented. Does anybody know how Christ is presented in the book of Mark? As a servant and as a slave. Yes. In Luke, he's presented as the perfect man, and in John, he's presented as the Son of God, or God. Right? And so his royal position is emphasized here as King of the Jews and eventually King of the world, right? So Christ the King, the short form for Christ the King. Now that's the theme all the way through the book here. And little marks. Okay, what's the first heading in the book of Matthew, Carol? Good. Origin of Christ the King, chapters 1 and 2. Okay, next division. Okay. What's another heading we used? Early ministry. Okay, so introduction of Christ the King, or the early ministry of Christ the King. Chapters. Okay. Next division. This is clock. Scene. Right. Principles of Christ the King. Chapters 5 through 7. Okay, back to you. Okay. Oh, I skipped Breckenridge. Number 4. Not remember? Oh, my water did. Carol? Blank. Credentials. Credentials of Christ the King. In chapters. 2 chapters in which he shows himself with authority in the natural realm, and in chapter 9, authority in the spiritual realm. Okay, this is real common sense progression of thought here. After credentials, he shows people that he has the authority and the power, and then he's opposed, he's rejected. So opposition to Christ the King. Chapters. Anybody? 3 chapters, 10, 11, and 12. Right? Remember the divisions there? Opposition to his message and his messenger, the disciples. It's in love. Right? And then in chapter 11, opposition to his forerunner, John the Baptist. In chapter 12, opposition to the king himself. Okay? All right, after the opposition to the king, we spent 2 weeks on this. Now that he's been rejected by his nation's leaders, chapter 13. What is? Yeah. And between his first and second coming, there is this whole span of time, and we call it the what? What form of the kingdom? Yeah, the church age is only part of it. It's the bulk of it. It's the inter-advent form of the kingdom, right? Or the inter-advent kingdom of Christ the King. You understand? Advent 1, Advent 2. You thought that was just a pious religious term, right? Advent. Oh, it's Advent. Right? It means coming. It's just a Latin word that means coming to. Right? Right? So the first Advent was Christ's first coming to the world. The second Advent, if you wish, is Christ's second coming. And between those two events in the big plan, she's got a picture of it, is a whole large span of time in the plan and program of God that we happen to live under right now. And it's the between the Advent kingdom. Now, is Christ visibly ruling from some throne somewhere in the world today? No, it doesn't look like he's ruling, but he is. Right? Invisibly from heaven. And he described what this kingdom is going to be like in all these parables in chapter 13. Really neat stuff. This is, if you really want to know what God's doing in the world today, you get to know Matthew chapter 13. That's why I put some of the notes together. Really an important section. Matthew gives insights here about this sermon that Jesus preached, or these parables, that none of the other gospel writers give us. They give some of them, but none of them give it in its fullness like Matthew does. So it's really a key chapter in the Bible to understand. These three chapters are really important too. This is the first major discourse of Christ. This is the second major discourse of Christ. I mentioned this last time. The third major discourse of Christ was also recorded by Matthew, chapters 24 and 25. Okay? It's known as the Olivet Discourse. That is the discourse that he gave while he was sitting in the Mount of Olives. All right, does this make sense? Now that he's rejected by his people, then he turns to the Gentiles. And most of the people who are saved during this period of time, when he comes back, he's going to save Israel and restore Israel to her place of privacy in his plan and his program. Just very interesting. I thought you could have another plan. Do you have one with it? If you'll notice the little green and red lines going through the center there from left to right. Notice how under the golden mountain, the green line came over the top of the red line. You see that? It was that was when the Jews were taken captive, right, in the Old Testament. And ever since then, they have been under the Gentiles. They have been under the Gentiles. So the red line represents God's plan for Israel as a nation. And prior to the Babylonian captivity and the Assyrian captivity, Israel did have actually a kingdom in the world. See, it actually had a historical kingdom in the world. Now today it's a nation, but it's not a primary nation in the world. It is fighting for its very survival today. Okay, and it's only when Christ comes back at this point in the plan and program, where this mountain is being destroyed in his second advent, you see, that he is going to subjugate the Gentiles and restore Israel to a place of privacy. Okay, in his plan and his program. Right? So between those, so all during this present age, even long, for 500, for 700 years before Christ came, the Jews had been under the Gentile yoke. Well, during the first and second advent, as Matthew 13 describes, Israel is not a visible entity. The church is the main thing. Okay? But that's not to say it's the only thing, because even during Christ's public ministry, there were Jews being saved. There were Gentiles being saved. And at the end of the age, the 7-year period, tribulation period, there are going to be Jews and Gentiles saved, even though there isn't a church at the time. A true church on earth, because the church is going to be raptured before it. And so this inter-advent age is describing aspects of all three of these things. Okay? It's not just the church age. And now we come to the seventh major division, which is, what did I tell you what it was today? Okay, key word is the faithful ministry. The faithful ministry of Christ the rejected King. All right? The faithful ministry. I'm supposed to tell you that my dad made that chart up. If you turn it over, it's not stacked, right? But it should be. Okay. When did you start working on that? Yeah, she was here. Remember Easter Sunday morning, she stood up and gave a bit of a testimony? That's her. Okay, so my objective is to try to cover one chapter a week. Okay, we're going to try not to get bogged down through this section. It's not as heavy stuff as the stuff that we've been in so far. Like these have been really important chapters in the book of Matthew to set the stage and to show how things develop. Okay, and chapter 14 is rather a simple chapter, so let's get into it tonight. There's a twofold division if you want to write it down for an outline. I hope to have it all typed up nice for you next time. I'm always a week behind. But verses 1 to 12 in the chapter describe cowardly King Herod. Cowardly King Herod in chapter 14, verses 1 to 12. And in verses 13 to 36, we have compassionate King Jesus. And the outline that as I develop it relates to these two headings. I think now it remains to be seen whether in each of our chapter divisions in this section from chapters 14 to 23, whether there's going to be a contrast drawn by Matthew. I don't know. It looks like it's possible. In this chapter, King Jesus, even though he's rejected and despised by his people, is still shown to be superior to the guy who's actually the king. You know? The real king is a coward in his castle, and here the spiritual king of Israel is walking around without any robes on, and but he's showing his true compassion and concern. He's caring for his people, whereas the political king could care less. Let's read the first 12 verses together, and as we work our way through it, I think you'll be able to see for yourself how King Herod was such a cowardly character. And we're seeing here really a negative image being stressed by the author. Verses 1 and 2 are the first point. King Herod feared John the Baptist and Jesus. He was actually afraid of John the Baptist. He was a very superstitious man. At that time, that is, after the time of the discourse where Jesus explained the parables about the inter-advent kingdom period, at that time Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus and said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him." Now, it doesn't say he was afraid of John, does it? But the following passage, as we read it through, explains that, and I think we've touched on this in some of our other studies in Matthew. Remember how John the Baptist had, back in chapter 11, he had been thrown in prison. This explains why he had been thrown in prison. The story isn't given to us in real strict chronology here. Okay, it says Herod had laid hold on John and bound him in prison, and he had done this. Well, way back in chapter 11, here in this section where Matthew describes the opposition that Jesus received, John the Baptist was languishing in jail down in the desert near the Dead Sea, where Herod had a castle. Get the name of the place. It will come to me. But King Herod had a fortress down in the desert there, and that's where John the Baptist was held. And so this passage tells us that what eventually happened shortly after John the Baptist sent his disciples to check Jesus out that last time. Shortly after that, Herod had put John the Baptist to death. Well, then after that, Jesus kept doing miracles. It says that at the end of chapter 13. It says in verse 54 that when Jesus was come to his own country, he taught the people in their synagogue, insomuch that they were astonished and said, "From where hath this man this wisdom and these mighty works?" Yeah. And verse 56, "From where then hath this man all these things?" Verse 58, "Jesus did not many mighty works there," that is in Nazareth, Capernaum area, because of their unbelief. But he was still doing mighty works. Okay? And great preaching and great crowds were following, as we see in this chapter. So Jesus was still being followed by a great throng of people, and Herod the king kind of got word of it. And this is a very revealing verse, by the way. Here is one of the most powerful men in the country, and he's not like your average, Mayor Fertizzi today. Yeah. Now, I don't know Mayor Fertizzi's personal religious views, whether he is a devout Roman Catholic or whether he's a secularist. I have no idea. The name like Fertizzi, I wouldn't be surprised if he's a devout Catholic. But anyway, this man was a devout man, right? He wasn't really religious, but he had religious inclinations. He was superstitious, right? He heard about Jesus' great works, and he was troubled within himself. It didn't say it, he was, but look at the conclusion he draws. This must be John the Baptist raised up from the dead. There's no other explanations for these mighty works that this man is doing. Not only does this tell us what kind of a religious mentality that the king had, but it tells us something of the age in which he lived. And it also tells us, if you wish, a third thing, and that is that when Jesus later rose from the dead, we are given here an insight into the way it would have affected people. You see? Now we know that John the Baptist didn't raise from the dead, right? But the king apparently thought he had. And apparently the great miracles that he did were as a direct result of his alleged resurrection. Okay? So had Jesus resurrected from the dead and done no miracles in his post-resurrection ministry, it would have called into grave question the validity of his resurrection. You follow what I say? In the gospel records, Matthew 28, Mark 16, Luke 24, John 21, John 20 and 21 all record for us several miracles that Jesus did in his post-resurrection ministry in a Jewish environment. Okay? In a time when people thought like King Herod. This guy was not all that different from his countrymen, surely. Okay? So, in a superstitious kind of a way, it's evident that King Herod was afraid of John the Baptist. Okay? He put him to death, but he wasn't ever quite sure just when John might poke his head around the corner of his castle. How'd you like to live with that? Any questions? It's a very revealing verse. Verse 2 there is very fascinating insight into the Jewish mind of the time. Now we read verses 3 and 4. Read it for yourself for a moment and tell me, who else was Herod afraid of? Right. Herodias was his new woman. Okay. Used to be his brother's woman. Okay. And that's why John ended up in prison, because he opened his big mouth and spoke the truth to the wrong guy at the right time, or the wrong person at the wrong time. Okay? And so evidently, even though he was attracted to her, he was somewhat intimidated by this woman. Have any of you ever watched one of those movies? I've seen a couple of them on television. Um, Hollywood really plays up this particular event. I remember watching one. They really made it a juicy affair, right? But she was, they did a good job anyway casting the personalities. Okay, I forget what was that. Peter somebody or other, very famous actor, played the part of King Herod. What's his name? And he narrated it. I don't know. It was. He's a big jolly guy. He's a, kind of a handsome-looking dude. He narrated the whole series on Russia there a while back. Peter Ustinov, is it? Is that his name? Peter Ustinov. Um, he played the part of King Herod, and they had this rather unattractive elderly woman, full of vices, playing the part of Herodias. Like she must have bewitched this poor guy, I don't know what she was doing wanting him, but they really did it well. And it's obvious that Herod was under the spell of this woman. He was afraid of her, and he was afraid to cross her, right? So he's a real man, this man, afraid of ghosts in his castle, and afraid of the woman that he married, and in verse 5, who else was he afraid of? He's afraid of the multitude. What multitude? There are all kinds of multitudes. Which one is this? It would have been the believing multitude. If they were not all true believers, at least the ones that were religiously inclined, right? Which probably in that day was most everybody. Okay. In other words, the Jewish populace, not all that different from their lousy king, were very superstitious people. A, B, many of them had actually repented of their sins and been baptized in the Jordan. There were many thousands of them, undoubtedly, right? Very many unhappy people who had been drawn to the message of the gospel, been saved, and John was their leading light. And the king had to play his cards very carefully about, well, he just couldn't go kill him because then he'd alienate the largest percentage of his populace, and that was the matter of concern for him. So he was afraid of the multitudes too. Now let's read together verses 6 to 12. Now when Herod's birthday was kept, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod, whereupon he promised with an oath to give her whatsoever she would ask. Now, when Hollywood did the movie, they made him half drunk, which is not all that unlikely. Okay, I mean, what guy in his right mind would give away half his kingdom to some pretty dame that was out there on the dance floor? Okay, and she, being before instructed of her mother, said, "Give me here the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And the king was sorry. Nevertheless, for the oath's sake, and them who sat dining with him, he commanded it to be given her, and he sent and beheaded John in the prison. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came and took up the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. Who else was Herod afraid of? He was even afraid of his friends. Okay, so he was afraid of his populace. He was afraid of his antagonist. He was afraid of his own woman. And he was afraid of his friends. Like, you can't have much more confident young man on the throne, can you? Yeah, yeah. It's almost hilarious when you think about it this way. Like, I never really noticed this until this afternoon as I was reading through this. And then what a sharp contrast is drawn for us when we see the true king of Israel, albeit rejected, walking around like a free man. He hasn't got a care in the world. He's not afraid of anything. What a contrast. Christ, the true king, faithful under fire, you know. And the real king, you know, is holed up in his little castle worried about all his troubles. It's, in literature, you would call this hyperbole, right? Hyperbole being just a big fat word for exaggeration. It's and irony is another word too. You know, you just put two things side by side. Another good English teacher's word is juxtaposition, where Matthew takes Christ and he sits him side by side with Herod in this chapter, in his story. And he just says, draw your own conclusions, people. You know? Okay, so Herod feared John, he feared Herodias, he feared the multitudes, he feared his own guests, his friends. That's what happens to people in the world. I caught about 10 minutes of a biography on my in-laws' television the other night on Howard Hughes. I really wanted to watch the rest of it, but we couldn't stay. But this guy was probably one of the richest men America's ever seen. And he was the man that had more phobias than anybody ever saw. You know, afraid of everything. He was afraid of everything. Okay, so in contrast to the cowardliness of the Jewish king Herod, we have a forceful section at the end of this chapter highlighting the compassionateness or the compassion of the true king Jesus. And his compassion is demonstrated in three or four separate situations. In verses 13 and 14, his compassion is shown on the sick. His compassion is shown on the sick. When Jesus heard of it, he departed from there by boat into a desert place privately. And when the people had heard of it, they followed him on foot out of the city. And Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion toward them. And he healed their sick. Right? So it says it right there. That's what's being stressed about Christ here. In the first opening words, talking about Christ himself, he's not a coward, he's compassionate. And he healed their sick, the sick people. Read verses 15 to 21 to yourself. I'll just put it on pause here for a moment. Just read that over to yourself and ask and answer the question, on whom is Christ showing his compassion in this next section in verses 15 to 21? And how is he showing it? Okay. On whom is Jesus showing his compassion? And what one word would describe these people? Hungry. Okay. The other ones were sick. Right? Actually, many of these same sick people were now hungry. It's the same instance, same category, or not category, but the same loss for words. The same event, really. So he'd just been healing their sick people. It was nighttime now. They were way out in the desert somewhere, and they just didn't have access to a village store. Now, how many of you had a chance to do a comparison of accounts? Have any of you done a harmony? The college students did. This event that you just read in verses 15 to 21 is found in all four Gospels. Okay? Now, we won't take the time to actually do the cross-referencing tonight, but this is what makes Bible study real interesting, because I've done this. You know, you just take what I did is when I did it was to read each passage and then There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 7 verses in the Matthew's account, and then I went to Mark's account, and I found the account that had the most verses, and I think John's account has the most verses. Okay, so I used that as the base account. I wrote down every fact in chronological order that John gives us, and then you just go to Matthew to change your pen color and just add in little notes from what Matthew adds, then change your pen color and add in little green notes, from what Luke adds and so forth, and then you get the whole picture. You see, for example, if 4 of you ladies were in Carol's car and you were going to go to town to go shopping, and you saw an accident on the side of the road, and then you were all called to be witnesses, and you were supposed, and the police individually and separately got you, in the back of the cruiser, and they wanted what you saw, and they wrote it down. Now, if you were to take those 4 police reports, not one of them will be identical, right? But they would be complementary. They wouldn't be contradictory. You see, even though you would leave something out that she put in, it wouldn't be contradictory at all, but it would complement. See, so they would, because the police weren't there, they need this, right, to what's the word? Reconstruct what actually happened. See, and I believe that's why, in many instances in the New Testament, we're given a variety of accounts of the same events. It's not because these guys just needed something to add to their book. Matthew records this for his own reasons. What he's doing here is stressing that Jesus Christ is remaining faithful even though he's being rejected. And for a long time he ministered in that. So he's demonstrating his faithfulness under fire. Right? In contrast to the lousy King Herod, Jesus was a great king and really cared for his people. So that's what Matthew's concerned about. But if you read John's account, that's not what John had it for. John writes the same miracle up and puts a whole different slant on it. He says that it was a test. Matthew doesn't even mention that it was a test. But Jesus was testing his disciples to try to get them to demonstrate back to him that they really believed that he could do it. That being God, that he had the solution for the people's problem. He was testing their faith, and they blew it. See? John adds that as a direct result of this miracle, that the people were going to make Jesus what? Now that really fits this. They were going to make him a king. Now, let me just read it for you. John chapter 6. No, I'm sorry. Oh yeah. Okay, so the conclusion then. John writes in verse 13, they gathered up together, filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves which remained over and above that which they had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, "Oh, this is really and truly the prophet that should come into the world." When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again into a mountain himself alone. That's very significant insight on this situation. I don't know why Matthew didn't pick that up himself and add it. It seemed like it would have been very appropriate. Mm-hmm. Yeah. We would like a prime minister and a premier who will give us everything we want and balance the budget. Okay. Well, sadly, people in our country are learning that you can't have your cake and your ice cream too, right? If you want everything you want, then you're going to have to just go ahead and live with a deficit. If you want to get rid of the deficit, then you're going to have to give up a few programs. Now, we got a bit sidetracked on politics there. I guess I was trying to get you to see that the scriptures do have the key here. I don't know why Matthew doesn't put it, but if you do compare scripture with scripture, you can actually get the whole picture. John adds that one of the results of this miracle was that Jesus perceived that the people were going to make him a king, and obviously it must have been the wrong motive, the wrong perception on their part. Great preacher, yes. King? What kind of a king do you want? See? And obviously the king that they were going to make him wasn't this kind of a king. He'd already described what his kingdom was like. Okay? He didn't want to be just a king over a bunch of people. Okay? He wasn't just interested in power. If he'd only been interested in power, then back here, in the beginning of his early ministry, he might have yielded to the devil's temptation. If it was merely power and prestige. Because the devil had that to offer. Okay. So I guess the point here is that Jesus was showing his compassion, his kingly compassion, by providing for the physical needs of the people. And unlike King Herod, sitting in his little castle over there, who surrounded himself with the goods of the land, and who made himself rich, this king was making the people rich. See that? Filthy rich. There was more than they could even eat. You see? I think that sometimes we overlook the simplicity of the whole miracle. The whole point was there was 12 bags more, 12 baskets more. Isn't that intended to show that he was able to provide abundantly, like more than they ever needed for these people? Whereas King Herod was afraid of his people. He wasn't providing for the people. He didn't have the ability nor the inclination. All right. And so Jesus showed his compassion on the hungry by feeding them abundantly. He fed them abundantly. Okay. And now you thought that he fed 5,000 people, right? He fed 5,000 men, not counting the women and the children. See that? Verse 21. Now, if there was 5,000 men, there might have been 5,000 women. And if there were 5,000 men and 5,000 women, there was undoubtedly 5,000 kids.
There was probably more than 5,000.
Right.
They're in what?
Okay. So we ought to actually, you ought to scratch out that thing in your Bible that says feeding of the 5,000. You ought to write in there the feeding of the multiplied thousands. You know? Could have been, who knows how many? Could have been 15,000 people then. Okay? Yeah, I know. Nobody.
5,000 men on fire.
Excellent. What edition of the Bible is that? That's a world Bible. Keep that one. When you get accurate chapter division headings, you got a good Bible. Anyway, that's really, I'm just being facetious. There were 5,000 things. Plus. Okay. There were several instances where Jesus fed large groups of people, or two anyway. There was another time where he fed 4,000 men. What did he feed these people? What did he start with? And this, don't read it. Just tell me. What you just read it. How many loaves and how many fish?
2 loaves and 5 fish.
Sure. Okay, would you check it out first, please? What did he start with here? Verse 17? 5? 5 buns and 2 smells. Okay. When he fed the 4,000, it was the other way around. I think he had 4 loaves and I don't remember, but it wasn't exactly the same. Right? That's really just an aside. Let's move on. Unless somebody has a question here. It's important that you compare scripture to scripture because Mark, Luke, and John have significant details to add to the story, which were actually part of the story. So the Spirit of God expects us to read them. No, we got started half an hour early. We have 5 more minutes. Some people eat to live, and some people live to eat. Okay. All right. Okay, I can't go any further. My whole mind. Okay, upon whom did Christ show compassion in the next episode, verses 22 to 33? I'll just put it on pause here and let you read through that. Skim through it. All right, so Jesus showed compassion. Showed compassion on the hungry in verses 15 to 23. Jesus now shows compassion on the frightened disciples. Okay, on the fearful or disciples, whichever you wish. Maybe they go together. What was it that was true of both the sick and the hungry in the preceding 2 episodes? Maybe we're allowed. Maybe if you just sort of read between the lines, would you say that these people that he healed who were sick and the people that he fed were believers or non-believers? Okay, maybe we can't draw too much out of it. Okay. In other places, it says Jesus had compassion on the lost because they were like sheep without a shepherd, right? And in fact, that may be even a commentary in one of the other 2 accounts in Mark and Luke on this very thing. That he had compassion on these people in the desert, in the wilderness, and on the sick because they were going around. So it might not be too much to say that Jesus met the deepest needs of the lost around him. He also met the deepest needs of those who were already found, if you want to phrase it that way, to save. But even saved people have needs, right? Maybe that's a dumb way to put it. Especially saved people have needs. Because when you become a Christian, you have problems that unsaved people don't have. Right? What was the need of the disciples here? You know the story. What did they need? Put yourself in that position and personalize it. What do you need when you're in a situation like this? Reassurance about getting saved. You need to be saved. Right? Christians need to get saved. Did you know that? I'm not saying you need to get saved over and over again, but we need to get saved from problems that we have, situations that we find ourselves in. We need to be saved from faithlessness. We need to be saved, delivered. It's saved in the sense of delivered, right? From, what was it you said? Somebody said uncertainty. What was it? They were going to drown, right? Um, I'm sorry, tossed with the waves. I guess it doesn't say that they're going to get drowned in this one. Sorry, I'm remembering what I preached on the other night in the water. Yeah, they saw a ghost. What they figured was a spirit, and that scared the willies out of them. Right? So he delivered them from their baseless fears. It was a baseless fear. It wasn't a spirit. It was really him. Okay, it was their misperception. We come into the Christian life with all kinds of screwy ideas, right? It takes time for the Spirit of God to go click and turn the light on, right? And really, when He does that, that's what Jesus did for these people here. They were already believers, right? But they needed to be delivered from this misperception of how what they were looking at.
Maybe we could do David Bread on the one about scarecrow. What is this?
Well, while you're looking, I'll continue. Ken Faulkner said last week that he was talking to me about D.L. Moody, an American evangelist, and I think it was D.L. Moody, and he when he became very successful in his ministry, one time a clergyman came up to him and said, "What is it that makes you so successful? I believe the same thing you believe. I preach the same thing you believe, and thousands of people get saved in your meetings, and very few people get saved in my meetings. Like, what's the difference?" And they were standing downtown, and Moody said, "Who do you see out there?" And they looked through the window of the store out on the street. And the guy said, "Oh, there's a guy going by on a bicycle. There's a man and woman holding hands over there. And this guy's going about his business here. And this lady's going here." And Moody said, "I see lost people on the way to hell. And it's all in your perspective, what you really see." See? And I would say that what God intended to do in your mind and in my mind the moment He saved us is nothing short of completely reconfiguring our thoughts and our perceptions. And it's a lifelong process. And He wants us to cooperate with Him. One of the best things you can do is think God's thoughts after Him. Right here. Doing exactly what you're doing. You know? Stop being conformed superficially to this world. Right? Quit worrying about the fads so much, is the teaching of Romans 12, right? But be continually, inwardly, is the idea, transformed, really thoroughly changed from the inside out. See? That's the process. Stop being conformed to the fashion of the world, but continually put yourself in a position where you're transformed. How? By the renewing of your mind. By the renewing of your mind. And that's the key. If I begin to think like Christ, if you begin to think like Christ, if we begin to see people like God sees people, if we begin to see sin like God sees sin, if we begin to see relationships like God sees relationships, if we begin to see money the way God sees money, time, life in general, just subject everything to the scrutiny of the Scriptures and to God's mind, right? The way He has revealed Himself. And we begin to think His thoughts after Him, then we begin to think like Him, then we are being delivered from our misconceptions. It's a really powerful lesson here, isn't it? That Jesus demonstrated His compassion on His own followers because He had great concern for them, because He knew that these poor guys who'd been following Him for 2 years plus, had all kinds of misunderstandings, and here they were out in the middle of a storm, and he'd left them. It says earlier in the passage that He went up on a mountain to pray, and He told them to go across the water. So they're out there smack dab in the middle of His will. This time the Master isn't with them in the boat like He was last time. So they don't have Him there to save them from the storm that it says they're in. right? And all of a sudden, in the fourth watch of the night, like they've been trying to go across this 9 mile lake all night. Now, how long does it take you to go? It's probably not even 9 miles. They were just going kitty corner anyway. So maybe 5 or 6 miles across the lake. It took them in the fourth watch of the night. Like if it gets dark at say 9 o'clock, the fourth watch of the night is just before 6 in the morning, right? So they were out there for over 6 hours trying to go across that lake in a storm. Okay. Now, what would you have been thinking about Jesus about 6 hours into a storm when he told you to go out into the storm? Like that's what the story's really trying to tell us here. Yeah? So Jesus walks out on the water there, and he knew that they were going to see the wrong thing when they saw him, but that didn't stop him from going out there. Didn't stop him from putting them in that position, telling them to go out there. I think afterwards, when they got thinking about it, they must have thought it all through, and they must have got it. He saved us from the storm, and he saved us from our delusion that it was a spirit, right? His words then was, it's, be of good cheer, be happy, don't be sad. It's me. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. It reminds me of a verse. I don't know exactly where it is. Somewhere in Jeremiah, I think, where God says to his people, I know the thoughts that I have for you. They are thoughts for good and not of evil. God has good thoughts for us. He has good desires for us. And part of our salvation, which is like, he saved all of us from our sins the moment we were saved. Okay? The guilt, that is. Right? And in the future, I'm saved from the eternal penalty of my sin. But in the process, I'm being saved from the experience of my sins, and not just my sins either, but also the power of Satan in the world and my flesh and everything else that's against me. Right? So part of a great salvation is that it's an onward process even today, in certain respects. Just one cross reference and I'll quit preaching. Galatians chapter 1. Verse 4, it says that Christ gave himself for our sins for this purpose, that he might deliver us from this present evil age according to the will of God and our Father. Deliver us from this present evil age. What's so bad about this present age? Well, it's evil. What's evil? Its values are evil, right? Its purpose, its motivations, its incentives, its objectives. Why do your neighbors get out of bed in the morning? Sometimes I wonder what motivates these people to go through this meaningless round of existence, right? Like, I know why I get out of bed in the morning. Get a house. No. I have something that I want to do for the Lord today, right? I want to please Him. I really consciously, I'm very conscious of this all the time. I just want to do what the Lord wants me to do. I want to please Him. And sometimes I get out of bed in the morning because I want to have fun. There's nothing wrong with that either, right? But under the umbrella, it's important for me to have fun and to relax once in a while, because if I don't, I'll go stir crazy, and then I won't be able to please Him. Like, you have to balance it all out. He made us body, soul, and spirit, not just soul and spirit. Okay. So sometimes I look after my body, sometimes I look after my soul. I always try to do it within the realm of the spirit. Okay. How did I get on that? Get off on that? Oh yeah, people live in this world only for bodily pleasures, only for emotional highs. They don't have the spiritual dimension. They must just put off tomorrow for the next day. Right? They can't look past tomorrow. Right? Or their objective. Maybe in 5 years they want to be a millionaire. So that's what they're trying to do. For the next 5 years they're going to try to be a millionaire.
I think the idea of Christian is that person standing on the screen and they're coming to mind. The idea of a Christian is they don't understand to save their life.
And it's realistic too. Yeah. Like why try to live only for becoming a millionaire, for example? Okay, so what happens when you become it? So what? What then? There's a real neat little track down in the rack down there. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's one of those cartoon ones. And it says, "What then?" And it's a conversation with this guy. You know, he walks up to this guy. He says, "Yeah, so what makes you happy? What are you going to do today?" And the guy tells him, "I'm going to go down to the store and buy myself a fishing pole." "Why?" "What then?" "Oh, then I'm going to go fishing." "What then?" "So I can catch fish." "What then?" "So I can go home and eat it." "What then?" You know, and he goes through. You know, and finally the guy turns around. "What then? What do you mean? What then?" You know. You know, like I mean, in the end, there's no purpose for it. If this is all there is, just to grow old and die, spend money, you know, purposeless existence, meaningless, right? But if there's God in the equation, then we're going to see Him after death. We're going to, I'd say, there or here or somewhere else, you know. And so that changes it completely. Wow, we really went down a rabbit trail there.
Someone read the story. I thought Peter came after he stopped the wind, but he didn't.
He doesn't say he stopped the wind.
It says the wind ceased. But Peter came while it was
Boisterous.
boisterous. I thought that phrase on anything.
Okay, so they were in the middle of a storm, and it's just before daybreak, right? And they're in the boat, and Jesus is out here with a pot can, right? So they're going like this. And they see the Spirit out here, right? So Jesus talks to them and says, "Don't be afraid, it's me." Okay? So then Peter says, if it's really you, let me come to you on the water. Right? The Lord says, "Okay, come ahead." So he got part way there. And then Peter needed to get saved. Right? Now, Jesus saved both the guys in the boat, including Peter. Well, he saved them from their fears. Like, you know, like he saved them in that, you know, the misunderstanding. Like he showed them it's me, right? So they're not afraid anymore. Okay, but then those guys, none of them but Peter were willing to take a step of faith, right? And even people who take steps of faith get into trouble, right? All the other Christians are safe back in the boat; they're not going to risk anything, right? Right? And so people who take a stand and go out, get out of their comfort zone and get out there and you know, drawing close to Jesus by faith, we never ever, no matter how spiritually minded we get, ever get to a place where we're not susceptible to need. We don't need saved from something in our Christian life. Peter represents a pretty high class Christian in my view. He was walking on the water. How many disciples could boast that they ever walked on water? Just one. Okay? Well, sort of, you know. I started to swim after a while, he says. Okay? And immediately Jesus caught him, right? Lifted him up and took him back to the boat. How did he take him back to the boat? I thought about that the other night when I was telling the story. It never dawned on me until I was telling the kids the story about Jesus saving Peter out of the water. What does it say? And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said to him, "O thou little faith, why didst thou doubt?" And when they were coming to the boat, the wind ceased. You know, were they 5 feet from the boat, or 25, or a quarter of a mile? See, how did Peter get back to the boat? Didn't tell us, you know, whether Jesus used him for a sea-doo or put him over his shoulder or held his hand while he walked on the water with him. And walked on the water? I do too. I really believe that Peter walked back to the boat on the water. That's debatable, but didn't Jesus meet that man's need? Sure. He rebuked him for his faithlessness, right? But in his mind, he probably said, well, at least you had some. None of these other guys is willing to step out of the boat. I like that. Any comments? You have a very strange grin on your face.
I was just thinking about what you said, dear.
Them they that were in the boat came and worshipped him and saying, of a truth thou art the Son of God. What are the pictures of the king that we're being given in this chapter? He's a person that can heal diseases. He's a person that can multiply bread super abundantly for people that meet their physical needs. He's a person that can meet the emotional distresses of his subjects. He's a person that can um, do things beyond our wildest dreams, like take us back on the water, right? And he's a person that ought to be worshipped. Right? We have extraordinary king here, right? Compassionate, powerful, um, caring. The last section, verses 34 to 36. Upon whom did King Jesus show his compassions in this section? Does anybody know where Gennesaret is? Okay, get your map out, back of your Bible. We'll pause. Feeding the 5,000 took place where? Took place right here. If you go back to the Gospel of John and compare Mark and Luke, it says that they went up from Bethsaida and they went over here. Okay. Okay. And then Jesus went up into a mountain. Well, this is hilly country here, right? And so he sent them across the sea. So they went across here like this, and this is Gennesaret right here, right, northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. Okay. And it says he healed all these people here. And if you go back to the book of John, it says the next day Jesus went up to Capernaum, which is right up here. Okay? And that's where all these people who had been here the afternoon before, where he fed them, the 5,000 plus people, they walked along the shore 4 or 5 miles here around the shore, and they found him in Capernaum. They said, "How did you get here? We were looking for you." And John tells us they were following the bread maker. They were looking for somebody that can give them free bread. So this whole section begins with Jesus the miracle worker and ends with Jesus the miracle worker. He starts out healing people on the east coast of Galilee, and then he ends up healing people on the west coast. Okay. Okay. So compassion on the sick again. Um, all that country round about, they brought to him all that were diseased. All they had to do was touch the hem of his garment. Amazing. Well, nobody has any profound observations. It's 5 minutes after 9. Time to quit. hopefully.
Ishmael. When Isaac was born, Ishmael was 14, and he teased him real bad, made fun of him, right? Just imagine a 14-year-old sibling that was from another wife, and that mother would be completely threatened by the birth of the real heir, because she was only a slave heir. Her son was only a slave heir, but this was the real heir. What a situation that created. You know, real tense dynamics. You read it. And Abraham's real wife nagged at him to the point where she made him against his will kick his other wife out with his firstborn son. Okay? And then that wasn't the only grief that came with Isaac. And we don't have time to talk about all the bad things in the ancestry here. But remember, God said, I want you to kill Isaac. Offer him up as a sacrifice. You talk about a test. And he was probably in his 20s at the time. He was a grown boy. The only one, son of promise.
So Abraham absolutely knew there was no possible way God was actually going to kill him. Somehow he was going to resurrect him or do something.
Yeah, that's
what. He was willing to follow God's lead. What about Isaac? He was willing to allow his father to do this too.
Yeah, well, that's why people look at Isaac in the Old Testament and they realize he's a real picture of Christ, because he was, in a sense, the only begotten, in a legal sense, the only real legitimate son, and he was meek and mild and obedient to his father and did exactly like his father wanted him to do, and he willingly offered himself. He's 20 years old. His old father, who's 100 years old now, isn't going to be able to fight his 20-year-old son in the prime of life and make him get in that altar if he didn't want to go to that altar. Those are the lines between the story. Well, Isaac begot Jacob, and that was a sad case too. Who was Jacob's brother? Denise? Yes. Esau. And remember when Jacob and Esau were basically twins. Who was the oldest one? Who came out first? Esau. Actually, Jacob's foot came out first.
No, he was holding on to Esau's.
Okay, I got it backwards. Yeah, okay. So Esau was born first, and so the firstborn was supposed to get twice the rights and twice the blessing in a Jewish family, right? Well, that wasn't a very happy family because mom picked younger son to dote on him, dad picked older son, and they just clashed for the rest of their lives in that family, right? And Jacob was constantly, he was mommy's pet, he was the cook, he was the meek, mild-mannered guy that couldn't grow a beard probably, and he stayed in the tent and just. Yeah. I'm trying to draw the picture for you so you can see it. Okay. They were just worlds apart in temperament, and it was a divided family. And for 70 years, 71 years, that family was at each other. And when Jacob was 71, he ran away from home because he was afraid that his older brother Esau was going to kill him. And his mother put him up to it. And his mother caused him to deceive his father. Real happy family, right? And he never got to see his mommy again. Yeah. Okay. Now we could just go on and on. If you remembered my sermon, you can pick out some. All you got to do, though, if you want to see the unhappiness of this ancestry, pick one of these names, look it up in the back in a concordance, and read the story in the Old Testament. And there isn't one of these that was a happy case. Judah was one of 11 brothers and one sister, or 12 brothers. He was one of 12 brothers and one sister, right? And they were all, with one exception, born in a foreign country in which their family served idols. The boys were all raised in a real down period of their father's life when he was walking away from God in the world, and he raised them. Some of them were 20 years of age when they left to go back to the land. And these were gnarly dudes. They were just real spiritual basket cases. You they were, the story goes, we don't have time for the story, but Judah's brothers, you know, they were siblings from 4 different wives. And that's why the fourth wife only gave birth to 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin, were the last 2 born. And Joseph was a babe in arms when his father came back into fellowship with God, and Benjamin was born, and when he was born, his mother died. So there were only 2 sons from Rachel, the favorite wife, and all these other sons were from the other 3 women in the family. And you can explain, there's sibling rivalry there. Real happy family. And they just hated each other. You That's right. Yeah, because Esau was going to come meet him. Well, anyway, the point is that um, these were a very unhappy bunch, and some of these boys that Jacob sired actually went to bed with some of his own wives, at different periods in history, and he cursed them when he was at his old age because of the things they'd done. They learned from their dad. They learned it. Huh? Um, Judah begot Perez and Zerah of Tamar. That's a story. That's a case of incest in the family right there. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't leave you with that. Okay. Solomon, verse 7, begot Rehoboam, and Rehoboam begot Abijah. Rehoboam. You know what's interesting about Rehoboam? He's the jerk that was so stupid that he broke the kingdom in half and created an instant civil war when his father Solomon died. Because he had his young advisors and his old advisors, and they were all giving him advice, and so he went with his buddies, the young guys. You thought my dad was tough on you, just wait till I get a chance at your pocketbooks. Yeah. And so, bang, created civil war, and it was never the same. Okay. Hezekiah begot Manasseh. Hezekiah, back up to verse 9. Jotham begot Ahaz, and Ahaz begot Hezekiah. Ahaz caused some of his own sons to be put to death through idol worship to a Moabite god named um, Moloch. Right? They sacrificed their babies to this false god. Well, Hezekiah survived his father's religious beliefs, and he turned against his father's godlessness and became a good king. But Hezekiah begot a son that became the worst king of Israel. Like, you talk about up and down. And Manasseh, the son of Hezekiah, who was the worst king that Israel had. And he reigned for 52 years, longer than any other king of Israel. And he was the worst. I mean, you talk about bad times in the nation. And Jesus was descended from this line of people. Okay? Sounds like my wife's genealogy. Well, because in part, God showed His grace and His mercy to these people as well. Like um, Salmon begot Boaz of Rahab. See, like Rahab had been formerly a prostitute, but God graciously, forgave her past and brought her and allowed her. Obviously, she married. Tradition says that she married Joshua, and from their children, God actually brought her into the very line of the Messiah to produce the Messiah. Like God, our past is our past, and where God brings us is, He blesses us. Yeah. And the same thing with Ruth. She had been a Moabitess. Okay? And then the same thing with Bathsheba. It says David the king begot Solomon of her that had been the wife of Uriah. In spite of the fact that, she was probably partly responsible for causing Solomon to want, or David to want her, by taking a bath out there in full view of the king's bedroom. God forgave them and blessed them because of their faith. I think they became believers. Repented of their sin. That is not to say that everybody in this list was a godless person or had some real personal problems. Sometimes the badness was related to their circumstances. A fellow by the name of Zerubbabel was in Jesus' line, and he was the guy that brought the Jews back, the first group of Jews back from captivity to the Promised Land. Right? Let me get it right here, in 539 BC. The first group came back, and Zerubbabel was the guy. And his children, he produced children from whom came the Messiah. I can't answer all your questions. I don't know why the Lord has it like this, for sure. But the background to Jesus' coming was the fact that God sovereignly worked it out, and he just brought Jesus from a line that went directly to David and went directly to Abraham. From David. Okay? God worked that out and brought his Messiah in answer to these very famous, very ancient promises back in Old Testament times. Okay? That's the sovereignty of God. And God overcame great sadness. I mean, this was my message. There was great sadness at Christ's birth. Look at Joseph and Mary's circumstances. Pretty sad situation. But God turned around and made it a joyful thing. God overcame all that checkered history and produced great and good and wonderful things, right? You may not be proud of your past. I'm not proud of some things I've done, right? But that's the past. And God is more than capable of taking my children and making them some of the best people that ever walked the planet, or their children, or whatever, that's what God does. He takes sinners and he brings good things out of it by his grace and mercy. It's neat, eh? That's the story of Christ. Terrible ancestry, but Christ came from that. Mary and Joseph had a terrible problem, but their problem turned into joy. Okay, and that's what the second part of chapter 1 is all about. The birth of Jesus Christ was in this way: when, as his mother Mary was espoused to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. You talk about a problem, right? I mean, in telling the story, in telling the bare facts of the story today, we miss most people just don't get the point. So Mary had a baby in a cave. That's kind of dumb. You wonder why she had a baby in a cave. Like, that's as far as it goes for most people, probably, if they even think about it. But it was planned. Isaiah 7:14, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and thou shalt call his name Emmanuel. It was predicted by the prophet Isaiah 800 years before it happened, that a virgin would bear a son, and that son would be God with us. That's what Immanuel in the Hebrew means. Immanu is the Hebrew preposition and in suffix it means with us. Im is with, and anu is us. Immanu, with us, El, God. With us is God. So they were only married on paper. That's what a spousal, Jewish marriage wasn't like North American marriage, right? Man and woman go to the courthouse, or they have a ceremony, they're married. They don't get any more married with the passage of time. They're married, right? In this culture, marriage was two-stage, okay? Marriage on paper during the spousal betrothal period, right? And then when the ceremony happened, then it was more like ours, and then they lived with one another. They were married, okay? But no, no. It may be in some of the Arab cultures. I don't know. But this is well illustrated in the Old Testament. If we had time to look up the references, you could see it.
A year, wasn't
It could be up to a year, right? But during this time, they were considered to be husband and wife. The dowry was paid, right? And the papers were signed, and she was his wife. Okay. Now the Indians in South America practice this, not quite to this extent, but when we visited the Yanomamo Indians in Venezuela, they a lot of those guys had their wives living with them, but they were 10-year-old girls. So they would raise them from a child. They would be given to them as wife as a child when the girl was a child, and they would raise that, and then when she became old enough to have children, then then they would procreate, and then they would be really husband and wife, But they were husband and wife for years before that, and he would just raise her in the family. That's the way they do it down there. Interesting. But in this society, especially during this espousal period, but not necessarily limited to the espousal period, a Jewish man had all the rights to divorce the woman. And the woman didn't have much rights during that espousal period. Right? And especially if she got pregnant by somebody else, then the man had real good options, real good legal right just to get rid of her. You know? And Joseph was a godly man because he wasn't going to be mean to her. He wasn't going to make a big spectacle of her. He was just going to quietly divorce her, put her away. That's what it means. God intervened in that sad situation and brought joy out of it. Right? Now, it was joy that was joy only by faith. He had to believe God. That would be tough to do. But it says he was a just man, and he was thinking about these things. And the Lord intervened. Yeah. Yeah. The angel spoke to him more than once. Okay? So it says that the angel was speaking to him in his sleep, told him about this stuff, explained it to him that this is actually a fulfillment. Look at verse 21. The angel, 20 and 21, the angel explained to Joseph while he was sleeping this night, right in the midst of this crisis, that the child in her has really been conceived miraculously by God's Spirit, and the child is going to be a male child, and you're supposed to name his name Jesus because of what he's going to do. And furthermore, now I don't think that verse 22 and 23 are the words of the angel. I think that's a commentary by Matthew, the author. See? I think Matthew butts in there, and he says, now, this stuff happened to fulfill an ancient prophecy, and he quotes in verse 23 Isaiah 7:14. See that cross-reference in your notes there? Isaiah 7:14 was given 740 years BC. Like that's a long time before. And so there's one of the first fulfillments of Scripture regarding Christ. And Joseph, verse 24, then Joseph woke up and he did exactly like the angel said. So Joseph was a man of action. He did as the angel of the Lord had bidden him and took to him his wife. Okay? He married her. Went ahead with it. I think that she was fat when he married her. I think she was showing. See, she was gone for the first 3 months. If you look,
John the Baptist's mother, right?
yep, she conceived uh, in you got this right? In Elizabeth's 6th month. And she stayed with Elizabeth. She went to visit as soon as she conceived. It says in Luke, she went and visited her cousin Elizabeth in the mountain country up there in central Palestine for 3 months. So she was 3 months gone before she came back. Now, some people don't show in 3 months, but some people do, right? And she was found with child of the Holy Spirit, and Joseph found out about it. You know, either she told him or he got a better look than usual and drew his own conclusions. Okay? I don't know. I'm just guessing. You can draw your own conclusions too. But he knew she was pregnant, and it was an act of faith on his part, and he married her, and they moved in together, but they didn't have sexual relationships until she was born. Knew her not till she had brought forth the firstborn son, called his name Jesus. 2 minutes for chapter 2. I don't really need to re-preach this because you heard my messages. The first message was great sadness at Christ's coming. The second message was great skepticism at Christ's coming. Joseph was skeptical, remember that? You know, you can see that. He was thinking about this and he wasn't quite sure. You know, he was doubting whether he should or shouldn't marry this woman. See? But I'm going to skip over that and just focus on Herod, because Herod was the skeptic of skeptics, right? And you read that in chapter 2, the first 12 verses really show us a contrast between Herod's skepticism and the skepticism of the religious authorities that were, that were available to, that were in Jerusalem with him. And who showed him up? You know, Herod and those guys were skeptical. Who wasn't skeptical? The skepticism is shown by contrast here. Yeah, the Magi, the wise men. See, these guys have come from a long ways. We don't know who they were. We don't know where they came from for sure. We can only guess. Okay, this is why you need to read a commentary, because the commentators generally explore the possibilities. Maybe these guys were had come from over this area, and they had contact with Jewish people living over this area as a result of the Old Testament captivity of the Jews to Babylon. Many Jews stayed there. Not all Jews came back. They would have had their scriptures. So maybe these were people from this area. See? That had, through a miraculous chain of events, had come to the star and to the knowledge of the scriptures, the prophecies. And there are prophecies in the book of Numbers that there be a star arising out of Jacob. Right? So who knows? All we know is that they were believers. They came looking for the king. They believed there was a king. They were certain of it. This week I've got all these maps around this place because we've been studying Bible lands and customs. Did you know that traveling in those days was a mite different than it is today? Right? They probably rode camels if they came from the east, because camels were the luxury vehicles of the day. Okay, they could go for a week or 2 weeks without water, and they have big feet, and they can walk on the sand. Just great endurance and stuff. Okay. Anybody that traveled the desert went on camels. Okay. They didn't go on the mountains. Fall over.